Hello there, I'm Margaret.
And my name is Richard.
Welcome to Shadows of Tinseltown, where we explore the real stories that the studio system tried to bury.
You see, Maggie, the problem with the old Hollywood myth is that we treat these people like they were carved from marble, or perhaps just projected onto it to satisfy our own need for gods. We look at a still of Barbara Stanwyck and see a dame, a broad, a femme fatale. We use these shorthand labels because they're comfortable. They fit on a DVD cover and make for easy retrospectives at the TCM festival. They allow us to avoid the person behind the persona. But the archive? The archive is never comfortable. It's full of jagged edges, suppressed depositions, and receipts that don't quite add up to the PR gloss. The truth isn't in the velvet curtains. It's in the riders of her 1934 contract and the suppressed police reports from the Frank Fay years.
I always thought she was the ultimate success story. Ruby Stevens from Brooklyn, the orphan who danced her way from the back row of a chorus line to being the highest paid woman in America by 1944. I remember reading that even the IRS was baffled by her earnings. She was out earning captains of industry at a time when women couldn't even get a credit card in their own name or sign a lease without a husband's signature. Before she was Barbara, she was a telephone operator, a package wrapper, a girl who knew exactly how much a nickel was worth because she'd gone days without one. It sounds like the quintessential American fable, the Ziegfeld girl who conquered the world through sheer moxie and a hard-hitting glare that could cut glass.
It's the brochure version sold to the fans in photoplay to make them feel like their own small, dusty lives might one day explode into Technicolor if they just worked hard enough. The truth is more of a forensic investigation into trauma and the cold mechanics of survival. If you look at the early days, the pre-code era, she wasn't just successful. She was a survivor of a system that was designed to chew up girls from Brooklyn and spit them out as set dressing for some aging leading man with a wandering hand and a bottle of gin tucked into his trailer cushions. Before she was a star, she was a product. She didn't just dance her way to the top. She worked with a kind of clinical, terrifying precision that left her peers bewildered and the executives nervous. She was a woman who realized very early on that if you don't control the frame controls you. She spent her life ensuring she held the camera's gaze on her own terms, often with a psychological violence that directors found both intoxicating and exhausting.
You mean the one-take reputation? I heard she was so prepared it was unsettling for her co-stars, like she was playing for keeps while they were just playing for the day's pay. I read that William Holden was so intimidated by her on the set of Golden Boy that he almost quit, and she had to personally coach him through his own self-doubt.
Precisely. And it wasn't just intimidation. It was a demand for reality in an industry built on artifice. Frank Capra, who discovered the real her in Ladies of Leisure, said she didn't just act, she was the character. He famously complained that he couldn't do second takes with her because her first take was so raw, so emotionally exhaustive, that a second attempt was just a pale theatrical imitation. She was a one-shot deal because she gave everything to the lens the first time, a psychological bloodletting that left the set in a state of stunned silence. Most actors save something for the coverage. Stanwyck burned the house down on the master shot. Why? Because Ruby Stevens knew that in the real world, you don't get a second take. If you miss your mark, you starve. She brought that no safety net mentality to every frame. She didn't require makeup. She required a challenge that was equal to her own internal pressure. Think of the bitter tea of General Yen. She played a woman caught in a cross-cultural psychosexual power struggle that would have broken a lesser actress. She didn't blink. But look at the cost of that total immersion. In the archive, we find the letters to her sister Millie, complaining of the hollowness after a day on set. She didn't just play a role, she let it occupy her until there was nothing left but the script and the characters' scars.
The cost being her personal life? I've heard the rumors. The distance from her adopted son, Anthony Dion Fay, whom she allegedly treated with the same rigid, almost militaristic discipline she applied to a film set. There are stories of her being practically Victorian in her expectations of him, rewarding him with silence instead of affection if he failed to meet her standards. A cold, transactional motherhood that left him adrift. And then there was the marriage to Robert Taylor, that beautiful, hollow man, which felt more like a studio-mandated arrangement, a lavender marriage to protect his image and her respectability than a romance. They were the most beautiful couple in the world, and yet they seemed to live in parallel universes of their own construction. Was she as cold as the character she played in Double Indemnity?
Cold is a lazy word, Maggie. It's the word the world uses for women who don't prioritize being liked over being respected. Let's look at the evidence through the lens of the archivist. She was a woman who had no safety net, no family money, no fallback plan. When you grow up in a series of indifferent foster homes after your mother is pushed off a moving trolley car by a drunk and your father disappears into the Panama Canal project to never return, likely to die in a muddy trench or from yellow fever, you don't develop warmth as a primary survival trait. You develop work ethic. You learn that sentimentality is a luxury for people who aren't hungry. And Ruby Stevens was hungry for a very long time. She saw emotion as a vulnerability that the studios could exploit, so she turned it into a professional commodity instead. She didn't have feelings. She had takes.
So the professionalism was a shield, a way to keep the industry from ever seeing the orphan underneath, to make sure no one could ever pity her.
It was more than a shield. It was a weapon of mass destruction aimed at the studio moguls. She was famous for knowing every crew member's name, from the gaffer to the script supervisor. She would share her lunch with the extras, not out of some performative charity, but out of a deep-seated solidarity with the laborers. She knew that the people who pulled the cables and set the lights were the ones who could make or break a shot, and she wanted them on her side of the barricade. Why? Because she knew they were the ones who truly made the movie, and because she wanted no one, not the director, not the producer, to have leverage over her. If the crew loved her, the studio couldn't touch her. She was never late. She never missed a line. That's not just professionalism. That's a woman building a fortress around herself so she can never be discarded again. She was the first woman to realize that in Hollywood, your only real friend is the person holding the light meter.
Indispensability as the ultimate insurance policy. If the machine can't function without you, they can't throw you out.
Exactly. If you are perfect, they can't replace you with a younger model. At least, not without a fight that would bankrupt the studio and alienate the unions. She made it mathematically impossible to fire her. She was the only star who could walk onto a set and tell the cinematographer where to put the lights. And they'd listen because they knew she was right. She wasn't just playing the game. She was recoding it from the inside, line by line, take by take. She even refused to let the studios own her image. She insisted on her own lighting technicians, her own costumers. She was an independent republic in a world of colonies. Look at her work in the early 30s, Night Nurse or The Miracle Woman. She wasn't playing types. She was playing women who had already survived the worst and were looking for the exit. In Ladies of Leisure, she gives a speech about how being good is just a way for people to keep you poor. That wasn't the script talking. That was Ruby Stevens whispering through the character's teeth, warning the world she was coming for the rent.
It changes how you look at the femme fatale roles then. It wasn't just a mask she wore, it was a projection of her own autonomy, a way of saying, I see the world for the transaction it is, and I'm setting the price for my own soul.
Exactly. Take Double Indemnity. Phyllis Dietrichson isn't just a murderer in a bad blonde wig. She's a woman trapped in a suburban cage, using the only currency she has, men's desires, to burn the cage down. Stanwyck played that with a lack of sentimentality that actually frightened the studio heads. Paramount was terrified. They wanted a why, a moment of regret, a single tear for the husband she betrayed to satisfy the Hays Code and the moralists in the audience. They wanted her to be a victim of circumstances, a misunderstood woman. She refused to give it to them. She understood that in the real world, the why is often just because I was tired of being small and I wanted to be big. In Babyface, she used sex like a ladder to climb from the basement of a speakeasy to the penthouse of a skyscraper. It was Nietzschean cinema, the will to power in a bias-cut dress. She was the pre-code queen because she understood that for a woman in 1933, morality was just a word used by people who already had everything they ever wanted. She didn't want the audience's forgiveness. She wanted their witness. She wanted them to see the climb, no matter how dirty the rungs were.
It's interesting you mentioned the studios. She was one of the few who went freelance early on, right? She didn't stay under the thumb of a single mogul like Louis B. Mayer or Jack Warner. Most stars were terrified of the blacklisting that came with being an independent, the loss of the publicity machine, the loss of the best scripts, the lack of protection when a scandal broke.
She was a pioneer of the independent contractor model long before it was fashionable or even viable. With her agent, Zeppo Marx of all people, she saw the contract for what it was, a velvet-lined prison cell. By 1932, she was already pushing back, refusing roles that made her a mere ornament. She had this instinct for the messy truth you're so fond of. She didn't want to be the ingenue. She wanted to be the woman who had lived. Look at Stella Dallas. She allowed herself to look garish, tacky, and ultimately, heartbreakingly rejected. Most stars of that era had clauses in their contracts about how beautiful they had to appear, ensuring their lighting was always soft and their angles were always flattering. The glamour clause. Stanwyck had a clause that basically said, "Let me work and let the character dictate the face." She understood that class in America wasn't just about money. It was about the way you held your cigarette, the volume of your laugh, and the way you looked at a man who was about to discard you. She knew the difference between being a lady and being a woman, and she knew which one paid better in the long run.
Even if it meant looking ugly or common for the camera. That must have been a revolutionary act for a woman in the 30s. To intentionally dismantle her own glamour to serve a narrative, that's not just acting, that's an ideological stance.
Especially then. She knew that the audience's pity was more powerful than their lust. She was playing for longevity, not just the next box office cycle. She didn't want to be a star for a decade. She wanted to be an institution for a century. But that independence came with a price tag. Because she wasn't protected by a studio machine, she had to be her own PR firm, her own legal counsel, her own muscle. She became a woman who trusted no one with her money or her reputation. She became the iron butterfly, delicate on the screen, but made of cold-rolled steel in the boardroom. She was the one who negotiated the deals that gave her a percentage of the profits, a move that would later make her one of the wealthiest women in the country.
And yet, for all that independence, she became this staunch, almost fierce conservative in her later years. A member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. It feels like a contradiction. The rebel who becomes the enforcer of the status quo during the McCarthy era. How do you reconcile the woman who defied the moguls with the woman who helped them compile blacklists? It seems like she became the very thing she used to run from. A gatekeeper. A woman who pulled up the ladder after she'd climbed it.
Is it a contradiction? Or is it the final stage of the survivor? When you've built your own empire from nothing but grit and a Brooklyn accent, you tend to become very protective of the walls you've built. She didn't trust the government. She didn't trust the unions. She didn't trust collective action. To her, collective meant weak, and weakness was the thing that got your mother killed on a trolley track while bystanders watched. She only trusted the individual and the work. The tragedy isn't that she changed. It's that she spent her whole life preparing for a battle that never really ended. Even when she was the queen of the Warners, she was still that girl on the trolley tracks, waiting for the world to push her off. The conservatism wasn't a philosophy. It was a high-yield insurance policy. She didn't care about the ideology of the blacklist. She cared about the perimeter. If the state offers you a safety net, they also own the shears. She chose to sharpen her own shears and help the moguls prune anyone who might accidentally set her house on fire.
It sounds like she traded her vulnerability for a crown that weighed her down. She became the matriarch of Hollywood, but the iron eventually became the whole person. There was no Ruby left, just Miss Stanwyck in a high-collared suit, giving orders to a camera that had watched her grow old. Did she ever regret the trade? Or was the crown enough? Did she ever look back at the Ziegfeld days and wonder where that girl went, the one who could still feel the floorboards under her feet without thinking about the contract?
That's the danger of the archive, Maggie. It shows us that the people we idolize weren't just talented. They were often desperate. Her toughness wasn't a personality trait. It was a scar tissue that hardened over a wound until the wound was gone and only the scar remained. Look at her work in westerns like 40 Guns. She's performing her own stunts at 50, being dragged by a horse across the desert floor for several takes because she still needed to prove she was the toughest person on the set. She couldn't let go of the reins because she was terrified of where the horse would go without her. She was a woman who defined herself by her endurance. If she wasn't suffering for the work, she wasn't sure she was doing it right. She was a martyr to her own legend, a woman who preferred the desert dust to the soft lights of a parlor. Even her home was called the ranch. She never truly moved back into civilization, because civilization requires a kind of trust she didn't possess. She lived in a state of permanent mobilization, always ready for the siege that never quite arrived because she'd already won.
So she wasn't a fable. She was a masterpiece of self-construction. A woman who decided who she was going to be and then refused to blink for 60 years. It's magnificent, but it's also incredibly lonely, isn't it? To never be able to turn off the Stanwyck and just be Ruby for an hour? To never let the mask slip, even in the mirror? To live entirely within the architecture of your own defense?
A masterpiece built on a foundation of scars, Maggie. Most people want the movie star. They want the blonde wig, the cigarette smoke, and the anklet from Double Indemnity. They want the fantasy of the tough broad who always has a comeback. But if you want the truth, you have to be willing to look at the scars and the silence that followed the cut. You have to look at the woman who went home to an empty house, her famous solitude, and studied lines until dawn, because the lines were the only things that stayed true when people let her down. People are volatile. Scripts are consistent. In a script, the ending is guaranteed. In life, you're just waiting for the trolley. She preferred the script every time, because the script had a logic that life lacked. She was a woman who realized that if you can't have love, you can at least have a perfect performance. She chose the immortality of the frame over the messiness of the flesh.
Thanks for watching until the end.
Have a good day.
Bye!